Stanford's presidential lecture series was begun in the 1990s. And from then, when the first speakers included the literary critic Harold Bloom, the architect Peter Eisenman, and the feminist theorist Hélène Cixous, the aim of the series has always been to celebrate humanities research and artistic practice at the highest level. We always aim to create rigorous but accessible events that challenge conventional thinking, raise provocative questions, and get people talking about the humanities as an indispensable factor in our lives. We're honored that President Jonathan Levin is among us today to make some remarks. His office sponsors this series. A distinguished economist, Jonathan Levin became Stanford's 13th president in August of 2024 after serving some years as Dean of the Graduate School of Business. He's widely recognized for his scholarship in industrial organization and market design, and we thank him warmly for making it possible for us to sponsor these lectures. Please welcome the president.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you to the presidential lecture in the Humanities and Arts, and to see so many people in this room, and welcome to everyone who is joining us via the live stream. As Roland just said, the presidential lecture in Humanities has been at an institution at Stanford for several decades now. It was created to celebrate and to elevate the humanities at Stanford, and to put attention on both the power that the humanities has to illuminate beauty in the world, and to challenge people's ideas and conceptions about the world, about themselves, about humanity, and to, as Roland said, spark discussion on the campus and in the community. And it has fulfilled that role admirably over many, many years at Stanford. And it's just a pleasure to get to be in a presidential role where I get to help to continue that tradition. It brings me back to my own roots here in the humanities, where I started as an English major before veering off path into economics and academic administration, of all things. So it's a real pleasure to get to introduce this lecture, and to be here in the Humanities Center, which has been around itself for 45 years, supporting scholars at Stanford in pursuit of humanities research and promoting the rigorous exchange of ideas, providing a forum for discussion and reflection. And to welcome Tommie Shelby, professor from Harvard, to give this year's lecture. I have discovered this year, because this is my first presidential lecture in the humanities that I've been able to attend, although I look forward to doing that hopefully for many, many years to come, that part of the tradition is the president has to read the books in advance, or at least is given the books in advance to read. And that was a joy for me over the last week, to dive into Professor Shelby's work, and I can't wait to hear what he has to say today. So welcome, Professor Shelby. Actually, welcome Roland to give a more formal introduction to Professor Shelby.
Thank you, John. Early on in his most recent book, The Idea of Prison Abolition, Tommie Shelby poses two questions. Can the practice of imprisonment be justified despite existing structural injustices, for example, institutional racism and economic injustice, or should the use of prisons be discontinued, wholly or in part, until these structural injustices have been corrected? Second, could the practice of imprisonment ever be justified in a just social order, or would a fully just society obviate the need for prisons and therefore make their use illegitimate and repugnant? End of quote. Questions such as these may appear to belong to scholarly and policy debates in fields such as law, political science, or criminology, and of course they do. But as Shelby treats them, they belong to a far older tradition of social criticism that extends back centuries. I had the disorienting experience 2 weeks ago of teaching Thomas More's Utopia, where on one page, he poses a question almost identical to Shelby's second question that I just quoted to you. Tommie Shelby describes his work as situated at the intersection between philosophy and Black studies. And while that description locates him in a contemporary university such as Harvard, where he teaches, I want to acknowledge his place in an intellectual tradition, a far longer tradition of socially engaged humanism, a tradition that encourages hard questions and unpopular answers, represented centuries ago by figures like More, in our own time by, say, Angela Davis, whom Shelby counts as a forebear. The present lecture series, as John says, going back almost 30 years at this point, has its own history of welcoming such thinkers, including Bruno Latour, Talal Asad, Joan Scott, and others, and it's our privilege to continue that history today. Tommie Shelby thinks and writes about justice, social justice, racial justice, economic justice, and criminal justice, and the institutions and experiences where these versions of justice converge. He is the author of We Who Are Dark, The Philosophical Foundations of Black Solidarity, 2005, Dark Ghettos, Injustice, Dissent, and Reform, 2016, which was awarded the Spitz Prize from the Conference for the Study of Political Thought, and the 2016 Book Award from the North American Society for Social Philosophy. His most recent book is the one I just mentioned, The Idea of Prison Abolition, which was co-winner of the Easton Award from the Foundations of Political Thought section of the American Political Science Association. He has served as president of the American Philosophical Association, Eastern Division, and is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Now, happily, Tommie Shelby is a not infrequent visitor to Stanford. 2 years ago, he delivered the Tanner Lectures in ethics. And when I invited him for this occasion, which was an invitation that went out after he'd accepted the Tanner invitation, but before he delivered the lectures, that gives you an idea how far in advance we make these invitations. He asked me, won't that be too much Tommie Shelby? But in the next sentence, he wrote that for us, he would talk about solidarity and intellectual life, a topic which gave us at the SHC a perspective with which we in turn considered this year's cohort of fellows. And we thought we would unofficially make this a year about these very questions. So notwithstanding the long lead time, we look forward to a lecture that is perhaps even more urgent today than it was when we first planned it 2 years ago. Please give Tommie Shelby a big welcome back to Stanford.
Well, thank you so much for that very warm introduction, and I'm very grateful to be here, very honored, in fact, to be invited to give this presidential lecture in the humanities. I'm gonna jump right in, assuming everything is working here. Let's see. Yeah. So when Richard Wright published his memoir, Black Boy, in 1945, the title chosen by the publisher reflected a story of a young Black boy growing up in the Jim Crow South. But Wright wanted to call the book American Hunger. I think that title better captures the essence of the book. Wright describes not only his own physical hunger, quite real, but a deeper hunger, an intense intellectual curiosity, and a longing to make sense of the world around him. This desire for a life of the mind raises important questions about what I sometimes call the political ethics of the oppressed. That is, about the principles and values that should guide the oppressed as they confront enduring injustice. When a social group is persistently denied their rights or basic respect, what place, if any, is there for members who seek knowledge or creative expression simply for its own sake? Is such a life an irresponsible retreat from the group's collective struggle for justice? Or is it consistent with the demands of group solidarity? So in this lecture, what I would like to do is explore some tensions between what I take to be two quite weighty commitments: the commitment of solidarity and the pursuit of intellectual life, with its emphasis on independent thought and free expression. While this tension can arise for anyone, really, my focus is going to be on its significance for oppressed groups, where I think this conflict is often particularly acute. Wright's life offers a compelling window into this tension. His childhood and family life, his conflicts with the Black community, and especially his uneasy relationship with the Communist Party, all reflect the challenges, I think, of reconciling a life of the mind with political solidarity. Wright grew up poor in the Jim Crow South, Mississippi, Arkansas, Tennessee. He came of age in deeply impoverished conditions. His father abandoned the family when Wright was quite young, and his mother had frequent bouts with serious illness, and this made it nearly impossible for her to hold down steady employment. So as a result, Wright's family suffered housing insecurity, and they rarely had enough to eat. At times, his mother had to appeal to charitable institutions for aid. And for a brief period, Wright and his younger brother actually lived in an orphanage. Though a gifted student, Wright was unable to regularly attend school because he often had to find paid work to support his brother and his ailing mother. Now, much of Black Boy chronicles this tragic aspect of Wright's youth, a time in his life that was, as he says, as dark and lonely as death. Now, when thinking beyond his own pressing physical bodily needs to the material needs of other Black people, Wright naturally emphasized the need for political resistance. Changing the material conditions that circumscribe the lives of Black poor people is obviously imperative, urgent. However, Wright also thought it was critical for Black people to satisfy what I'm here going to call a kind of spiritual hunger, a craving for meaning and moral purpose. He sought to explain how a political ethics of the oppressed should respond to this specific kind of deprivation. Now, here Wright's own life, I think, is particularly instructive. He reports that as soon as he learned some basic math and gained literacy, a consuming curiosity grew in him. He became one of those annoyingly inquisitive children, constantly asking questions of adults about his social environment and its prevailing norms. At age 12, his curiosity was dramatically fueled after he was first introduced to novels. As he says, "I had tasted what to me was life, and I would have more of it, somehow, some way." His insatiable appetite for books would eventually extend beyond fictions to other subjects like sociology and psychology and even philosophy. He says, here I quote, "A vague hunger would come over me for books that opened up new avenues of feeling and seeing." This love of reading quickly expanded into a love of writing. As Wright says, "Wrestling with words gave me my moments of deepest meaning." Wright describes this devotion to reading, writing, and learning as not a mere diversion from the harsh realities of life or something done, say, for occasional enjoyment. Rather, for him, it was a way of life. The curiosity that drove Wright was not just for like a practical kind of knowledge. He wasn't necessarily looking for the key to liberation or concrete strategies to fight injustice. It was really sort of learning for its own sake, an intellectual nourishment, if you will, that he was after. His attitude towards life was one that, quote, "made him love talk that sought answers to questions that could help nobody, that could only keep alive in him that enthralling sense of wonder and awe in the face of the drama of human feeling, which is hidden behind the external drama of life." Now, of course, not everybody develops this kind of deep sense of curiosity or abiding interest in ideas. The thirst for knowledge is perhaps even rare amongst those who are severely oppressed. The truly disadvantaged are more likely to be preoccupied with daily survival. And there isn't generally that much time or opportunity to take up truly intellectual pursuits. Moreover, many are actively discouraged from taking up pursuits of this sort, or they face quite formidable obstacles to doing so. But there are some among the oppressed who do nonetheless acquire this abiding curiosity. And a few, like Wright, develop an ambition to pursue a life of the mind as their primary vocation. We become intellectuals. Now, within this category of intellectuals, I mean it somewhat broadly. Right here, I'm thinking writers, of scholars, of journalists, of various artists, visual, performing, and still others. As I reflect on the ethical lives of oppressed people, I'm led to ask a question that perhaps people from more privileged groups feel no need to ask. And that is it acceptable to take up purely intellectual pursuits as a way of life amidst grave and enduring injustice? Does political ethics of the oppressed permit this kind of orientation toward living? Now, within the African American political tradition, one generally finds only negative answers to this question. Given the imperative to improve the lives of the unjustly disadvantaged, intellectual work for its own sake often strikes many as, at best, selfish indulgence, and at worst, callous disregard for the urgent needs of the oppressed. The priority for members of oppressed groups, some would argue, should be political resistance. Insofar as intellectual pursuits are defensible, these endeavors must be in the service of a liberatory aim: public protest, political education, exposing injustice, defending political ideals, and so on. Intellectual life for its own sake will be a legitimate practical aim, some would argue, only when just conditions have been secured. Or in a phrase, intellectualism for its own sake only after the revolution. We might call this the service conception of intellectual endeavors, and it is defended by the great Black radical thinker W.E.B. Du Bois. In his 1926 essay, Criteria of Negro Art, Du Bois argued that Black artists have an indispensable role to play in creating a just world. They have a duty to use their art to advance the cause of justice and of Black freedom. A political, intellectual, and artistic activity, Du Bois insisted, is not threatening to those in power. Just the opposite, in fact. The powerful welcome and solicit such pursuits and may even reward them, so long as this will prevent or lessen militant agitation for equality. We must, Du Bois maintained, avoid playing into the hands of our oppressors. And this, of course, would include resisting the temptations of money, of fame, and public celebration that sometimes come at the cost of our group's advancement and even our own self-respect. Not only are Black people not allowed the full intellectual artistic freedom that others enjoy, they are largely limited to forms of inquiry and creative expression that don't challenge white dominance. And Du Bois reminds us that though the fight for equality has been long, it's been exhausting, and at times, frankly, deadly, Black people should not channel their intellectual and artistic energy into work that white people will permit and admire. Now, Du Bois's strictures would appear to apply most strongly and maybe even exclusively to those with obvious intellectual gifts. This is because such talent could perhaps be used to advance the group's pressing justice claims. And Du Bois argued in places like his famous 1903 essay, The Talented Tenth, that intellectually gifted Black individuals should provide leadership for their people. Their talents should be devoted to solving what he called the Negro problem. Within the Black political tradition, what I found is that the main argument for this position centers on the commitment of solidarity. The members of oppressed groups do have strong reasons to commit to in-group solidarity. I've argued for this myself. This solidarity serves as a collective self-defense against maltreatment and as a vehicle for advancing the group's emancipatory cause. The effectiveness of this group unity is, of course, going to depend on members using whatever abilities, whatever opportunities, resources they happen to possess to aid the group in its struggle for justice. And here, there must be, Du Bois would insist, a broad division of labor within the group, with each playing the role they're best suited for, and each contributing where they are most needed. So, for example, we intellectuals have privileges, we have resources, training that could perhaps help us expose injustices or diagnose their causes, perhaps to even discover solutions to the group's predicament. Now, I think it's important to distinguish here the advantages that some intellectuals have that other members of oppressed groups also might enjoy. So these others might lack various intellectual interests or skills, say, but they might have other advantages, such as class status or material resources or political influence, social capital or institutional position. So, for example, there might be, say, a general duty for all the people, the most privileged members of the oppressed group, to use whatever material resources they have at their disposal to help those who are most in need in the group, the most unfortunate in the group. It's a kind of general duty. And moreover, we should also note that not all intellectuals are privileged in this sense. I think some are poor, some imprisoned, or otherwise deeply disadvantaged. So I don't mean to conflate being an intellectual with being, say, an academic or something like that. So the question then is whether there are abilities and skills specific to intellectuals that we should be using for the good of our unjustly treated group. These can include things like our kind of analytical thinking or other forms of critical thinking, might include competence with various research methods, advanced or specialized knowledge in some field, or maybe even just the ability to write effectively, perhaps extraordinary creativity, and so on. Now, when speaking of a special role for Black intellectuals, the argument I'm thinking through here does not imply that intellectuals have a greater responsibility to correct injustice than other people do. No, and everybody has a responsibility to contribute something to correcting unjust social arrangements. Rather, by special here, I mean a distinctive role. So when it comes to intellectuals, our distinctive role is going to be in virtue of our intellectual skills, talents, and opportunities. And so we should carry the struggle forward, perhaps largely on the battlefield of ideas. So you could think here of perhaps a scholar activist or a public intellectual, but others besides. So in view of this argument, someone like Richard Wright could be regarded as running afoul of the political ethics of the oppressed. He could be said to have misused or perhaps wasted talents that could have contributed more to freeing or helping his people. So what I want to do for a few moments is think about how Wright might respond in his own defense. Now, there's much in this argument I've been sketching for the special role of Black intellectuals that Wright might concede. So Du Bois and Wright, I take it, would agree, for example, that among the stigmas that denigrate Black people is the stereotype that we are of low intelligence and incapable of true creative excellence. Racist ideologies suggest that Black people have limited cognitive ability, which makes us suited for only perhaps the most menial and subordinate roles in society. So when talented Black people demonstrate their gifts through intellectual or artistic pursuits, this arguably serves to refute a deeply insulting stereotype. Moreover, Black youth sometimes accept stereotypes about Black ability and then severely truncate their own aspirations, adapting them to more limited life goals. So Black intellectuals and artists can counteract this tendency by setting an example of Black excellence in these domains. This example could inspire Black youth, it might boost their self-confidence, might provide them with concrete models that they might emulate. And this kind of salutary effect could be realized, here, and I want to emphasize, even if such intellectual pursuits are not undertaken for that purpose. So an intellectual artist who pursues a life of the mind or creative expression for its own sake, provided they do it well, nevertheless will contribute to define the racial order. Their work of the mind is a kind of rebellion. It's a revolt against accepting their low place in the status hierarchy. A life focused on ideas, then, can itself be a kind of resistance, despite this not being the person's conscious aim or motivation. I think Du Bois and Wright would also agree that the pursuit of knowledge can help one better understand one's own social conditions. One is less unfree, though perhaps maybe somewhat more discontent, when one has a clear grasp of the nature of one's subordination. Liberated mind, that's half the battle, we say. Right? And as black radical feminist Bell Hooks suggests, this kind of knowledge can be healing for the oppressed, perhaps leading to a kind of political awakening. Such learning could also lead to solutions to the group's problems, or at least to ways of reducing its suffering. Again, I want to emphasize this need not be the aim of the inquiry. Practical solutions, sometimes to existing problems, sometimes arise when we're thinking about other things. Right? So, though we're just satisfying our own curiosity, perhaps, right, that might be our main motivation, we might sometimes hit upon ideas that have practical relevance. So oppressed groups should encourage deep learning and critical thinking among their members, for this increases the chances that they might find paths to liberation. There is, I think, a lot of truth, I think quite important truths in this kind of, or these kinds of responses to Du Bois's concerns. I would defend them. Yet I fear that they can see too much to the service conception of intellectual life. They imply or they presuppose that a life of the mind is justified only if it contributes, at least directly or in the long run, say, to the group's struggle for justice and liberation. So what I'd like to do is offer a somewhat different, less defensive response to Du Bois. So the basic claim is pretty simple. It's that the oppressed are not only entitled to certain basic freedoms that they're often denied, but their attempts to exercise these freedoms, even under constraint, even in the face of systemic injustice, is compatible, I think, with their solidaristic obligations. So the freedoms I have in mind here are going to include more than political liberties, right to vote, to protest, speak truth to power, and so on, critical, vital tools in the pursuit of justice. But members of oppressed groups are entitled, I think, to something more than that. They're also entitled to the freedom to seek meaning. That is, they should be free to shape their lives in accordance with a worthwhile ideal of life. And I think to deny this is to say that the oppressed must wait for justice before they can truly live. And don't get me wrong, some will naturally find such meaning in fighting injustice. And I in no way want to disparage political activity as a way of life. It can be an admirable, honorable way to live. But not all are going to find this way of life fulfilling or attractive. And I don't think it all should be expected to. The issue, as I see it, is about the freedom to take up pursuits that are both worthwhile and intrinsically satisfying, even if these pursuits have no real potential to change society for the better. Resistance and survival aren't the only imperatives for oppressed people. We might speak of the pursuit of meaning as a freedom the oppressed are not obliged to abandon or delay until justice is realized. So to clarify, I don't think meaning is purely subjective. I think truly meaningful lives are good lives, well-lived lives. Some lives, though favored by those who live them, are, I think, frankly, pathetic and contemptible. Consider a life spent amassing a fortune for no better purpose than surpassing others in wealth. Then there are lives that sharply conflict with our moral duties to other people. Right? Living as a gangster so that one can just experience the power over other people, that reveals, I think, a distorted sense of what makes a life worthwhile. But I am a pluralist about meaning, right? There are many ways to live a meaningful life, right? And one such way is a life devoted to satisfying one's intellectual curiosity or creating things of beauty. Again, my contention is that pursuits of this kind, when taken up as a way of life, are consistent with the political ethics of the oppressed. I don't believe that other oppressed people, even other Black people with whom I have solidarity, have grounds to object to the exercise of this freedom. I can't really see the case for thinking that an apolitical life of the mind comes at the expense of other people. People don't have a valid grievance, I think, against Black intellectuals who choose to contribute to the collective struggle in other ways. I do believe that solidarity can and usually does require personal sacrifice. But I think the traditional Du Boisian division of labor premise, that each must play the role they are best suited to perform, is really too demanding and overly prescriptive. We don't have a responsibility rooted in our commitment to solidarity to use our talents in a maximally efficient way to advance the group's emancipatory cause. And I think to think otherwise is to view our individual lives as, say, mere instruments for the efficient production of justice. The oppressed are not obliged to see their lives as no more than heroic scenes in a grand story in which their oppressors are ultimately defeated. Interestingly, Du Bois did view his life that way. In his 1940 memoir, Dusk of Dawn, an autobiography of the race concept, he says this, and it's what he calls his opening apology. My life had its significance and its only deep significance because it was part of a problem. But that problem was, as I continue to think, the central problem of the greatest of the world's democracies, and so the problem of the future world. Now that life, despite his conceit, was no doubt appropriate for Du Bois. I'm glad, I'm grateful that he chose it. But that life, I think, is not fitting for all of us. Not even for all of us who claim the label intellectual. And so I find the argument for solidarity tempting in a lot of ways. The legitimacy of the individual pursuit of meaning, even under conditions of oppression, leads me to conclude that we have to have some personal discretion in how we'll contribute to such collective struggles. And this discretion, I think, includes not putting our unique assets at the disposal of the group if this would mean undercutting or undermining our pursuit to find some meaning in our life. That said, I think there's actually a perhaps deeper tension between the demands of solidarity and the pursuit of meaning through intellectual life. And this is because the commitment to the life of the mind makes its own demands. And these demands, I think, can pull against the requirements of solidarity. Intellectualism, think of it as a kind of vocation, comes with its own distinctive dispositions and prerogatives. Intellectuals, properly so called, strive to cultivate and maintain an independent critical mind. We think for ourselves, often challenging received wisdom and probing the assumptions others take for granted. We're willing to entertain strange and unpopular ideas, and at times to embrace positions that other people might find perplexing or even unsettling. We question the legitimacy of inherited traditions and established authorities, including those we may perhaps once have revered. Intellectuals are marked by a disposition, sometimes even a compulsion, to reconsider our own beliefs. For us, dogmatism is really intolerable. Ignorance is a kind of condition you have to constantly resist. When we speak or write publicly, we aim to say only what we sincerely believe. And so it's no surprise that intellectuals seek environments where open expression is not only permitted, but protected. Spaces where we can think aloud without fear of censorship. or reprisal. Now, a lot of people in what we might call the professions of the mind, scholars, scientists, writers, artists, and so on, may not be and wouldn't think of themselves as intellectuals in the sense that I have in mind here, because they don't really see their work as, say, a kind of vocational or ethical calling. They might approach it in a different way. Moreover, in describing the demands of intellectual life here, I don't mean to suggest that all who answer this call fully live up to the demands, right? And I don't exempt myself. So what I want to do here in the remainder of this lecture is explore a tension between this commitment to the life of the mind and the commitment to solidarity. And again, I'm going to use Richard Wright's life and writings as a kind of guide or way into this, because I think they're particularly instructive. I think he can help us better understand really the depth of this conflict and maybe some possible resolutions to it. Now, solidarity can exist in lots of different types of groups, including families and religious communities, ethnic groups, and other social groups that perhaps don't share a political cause. And so I'm going to start by highlighting the conflict that can exist between the life of the mind and the solidarity within these kinds of groups. When Wright was in the 8th grade and living in Jackson, Mississippi with extended family, he wrote and published his first short story in a local newspaper, the Southern Register. He called the story "The Voodoo of Hell's Half Acre." Unfortunately, this piece is apparently lost to history, but Wright, he says the plot was about a villain who sought a widow's house. And he described the story as, quote, crudely atmospheric, emotional, intuitively psychological, and stemming from pure feeling. Wright was proud of the story, but his friends and family reacted quite negatively to it. His intellectual and artistic interests kind of immediately alienated his friends. They couldn't understand, why would a Black kid write a story just so others could read and be amused by it? His zealously religious grandmother objected that the story wasn't true, and so condemned it as the devil's work. His Uncle Tom expressed contempt for the story, dismissing it as having no point. His Aunt Addie was appalled at the use of the word hell in the title, and thought it suggested that Wright needed an adult to guide him toward better ends. Even Wright's mother, usually completely supportive, chastised him for being weak-minded and hurting his chances at finding local employment. When Wright was in the 9th grade, and this was really his last year of formal education, he was selected valedictorian of his class, and he was given the task of delivering a public speech on graduation night. He dutifully wrote the speech, and again, he was really proud of it. But the principal of the school demanded that Wright deliver a speech that the principal had written for him, telling Wright, "You can't afford to say just anything before these white people that night." Yet Wright declined, offering the reason that he didn't want to give a speech someone else had written. In an angry response, the principal threatened Wright with not graduating and with being blacklisted for teaching jobs in the community. Wright still refused to submit. He mused, quote, "The principal's speech was simpler and clearer than mine, but it did not say anything. Mine was cloudy, but it said what I wanted to say." After news spread about his conflict with the principal, Wright was pressured by his classmates and by family members to reconsider. He didn't. And on graduation night, he delivered his own speech and received only faint applause, he says. But he says he didn't care. During the Jim Crow era of the American South, churches functioned as more than places of worship and religious ritual. For Black people, they were sites of communal solidarity and sometimes political organization. In Black Boy, Wright tells the story of his baptism. He was urged by friends to attend a church revival despite his open lack of interest in religion, and he reluctantly agreed. On the night of the revival, a small group of Black boys, including Wright, were singled out as belonging to no church and professing no religion. And they were pressured to make a public confession of faith and to join the church. And Wright interpreted this action as a communal demand that he make a public vow to join the community in solidarity. So he says, "We young men have been trapped by the community, the tribe in which we lived and of which we were a part. The tribe, for its own safety, was asking us to be at one with it. Our mothers were kneeling in public and praying for us to give the sign of allegiance." Now, this demand, Wright tells us, was not really about belief in God. It wasn't really about eternal salvation. This tight little Black community, as he described, needed to know whether Wright and the other boys were committed to being trustworthy members of the group. This demand for conformity to in-group expectation was a kind of test of loyalty. And Wright ultimately submitted, allowing himself to be baptized. Though he felt anger and a bit of shame even for going through with it, he was relieved to have this barrier between him and the community removed. It's nevertheless clear that Wright didn't think he should have to confess a faith he didn't share, to publicly express a belief that he didn't accept. Now, these three examples, Wright's first short story, his valedictorian speech, his reluctant baptism, I think these all illustrate how the norms of solidarity can sometimes conflict with the commitments of intellectual life. And I think the tension between solidarity and intellectualism is often even more profound when the solidarity is rooted in political values and objectives. I think we can see this if we consider Wright's rocky affiliation with the Communist Party. Wright left the American South as a young man searching for personal freedom and in pursuit of a writing career. At the age of 19, he moved to Chicago, where he lived for 10 years. And there he worked really quite long hours as a postal clerk and an insurance salesman, but he read quite voraciously at night and wrote poetry and short stories in his limited spare time. In 1933, Wright joined the local John Reed Club. For those who don't know, founded in 1929, John Reed Clubs were organizations for left-wing writers and artists. The clubs were affiliated with the Communist Party and were often used by the party to try to gain influence among radical intellectuals. Rejecting the idea of art for its own sake, the club's slogan was, "Art is a weapon in the class struggle." Soon after joining the Chicago branch of the club and actually becoming its executive secretary, Wright joined the Communist Party itself. During his years in Chicago, Wright came to know lots of different types of communists, some white, some Black, and he, by his own admission, embraced many communist ideas, particularly his opposition to capitalism, to imperialism, and to fascism. However, he came to worry about the influence of communist political practices among Black people. Here's one place he registers that. Black communists' emotional certainty seemed buttressed by an access to a fund of knowledge denied to ordinary men. But a day's observation of their activities was sufficient to reveal all their thought processes. An hour's listening disclosed the fanatical intolerance of minds sealed against new ideas, new facts, new feelings, new attitudes, new hints at ways to live. They denounced books they had never read, people they had never known, ideas they could never understand, and doctrines whose names they could not pronounce. The ideological certainty and militant ignorance that Wright here is identifying is, I think, not peculiar to communist forms of political engagement. I think lots of different types of social movements and political organizations can exhibit and encourage these kinds of tendencies, which I think are really antithetical to the life of the mind. Solidarity, when organized around a political cause and its ideology, is, I think, sometimes threatened by the dispositions of intellectuals. I think it's not really difficult to understand the dangers. I'm going to try to highlight it. So solidarity, right, it's built on a commitment to a specific set of values or objectives. That's the basis of the identification, right? These are generally treated as settled convictions, not subject to kind of reconsideration and revision. An unwavering embrace of these values and ends is treated as a test of loyalty and trustworthiness among those who are committed to the cause. But the intrinsic curiosity and incessant critical questioning of intellectuals really has no bounds. No idea is off limits, not even the values and ends that constitute the group's solidarity. This kind of engagement with ideas can cause a lot of anxiety within the social group or political organization or social movement. And the basic dynamic can be illustrated through Wright's experiences with the Communist Party. After Wright's first communist unit meeting, which was composed here only of Black members, comrades derisively and condescendingly referred to Wright as an intellectual, largely because, he would say, because of his manner of speech, as they would say sometimes, you talk like a book. He was later chastised for reading books not endorsed by the party. He was told, quote, "Reading bourgeois books can only confuse you, comrade." The communists, he knew, lacked curiosity. They seemed content to be exposed only to ideas the Communist Party approved. He was warned more than once that intellectuals, quote, "don't fit well into the party." Some have been expelled for a lack of revolutionary loyalty, and a few have even been shot. Wright's interest in reading broadly and writing craft and abstract ideas really made his comrades really uneasy and anxious, suspicious even. And the more he tried to make himself understood, the deeper the distrust that he seemed to face. Nevertheless, he tried to fight hard to make a space for artistic freedom within the party and certainly within the John Reed Club. But his proposals, he reports, were repeatedly shot down, voted against. And at one point, the party leaders demanded that writers abandon their intellectual and creative projects and instead produce pamphlets for trade unions. So at this moment, the John Reed Clubs faced a kind of grave crisis. And in 1935, through an abrupt Communist Party decision, the clubs were completely disbanded. Now, Wright openly dissented from the party's decision and found that he could not adapt to this new policy. As he says, quote, "My writing was my way of seeing, my way of living, my way of feeling. And who could change his sight, his notion of direction, his senses?" Consequently, Wright's relationship with the party grew worse. Accusations against him proliferated. People called him the smuggler of reaction, bastard intellectual, incipient Trotskyite, and so on. And soon, formal charges of disloyalty would be made against Wright. And he would make a quite public break with the party, despite, he says, having really little disagreement with his basic principles and vision. Of course, you might just say, look, this is just the well-known excesses of the Communist Party, and there's no real deep tension between political solidarity and intellectual life as such. And certainly the problem was particularly acute and perhaps extreme in this case, I would admit. But I think the lessons here really have quite broader application, and I hope you'll agree. Indeed, the basic tension can arise in political organizations and movements that sometimes pride themselves on non-hierarchical forms of organization, and for reasons I'll try to explain. Now, Wright thought it was irrational for political organizations, social movements to be hostile to intellectuals. Now, I wouldn't say it's strictly irrational. I do, of course, agree that it's misguided and I think ultimately unethical, but I don't think quite irrational. Some are wary of intellectuals because they often challenge the beliefs and values that anchor people's social identities. When a political cause becomes central to one's sense of self, when it provides deep meaning and moral purpose, it's natural to resist sharp criticisms of that cause. Many people are going to prefer to engage only with ideas that reinforce their convictions. This kind of critical probing of intellectuals, however, can introduce doubt, can pose a kind of almost existential threat to those identities that are tightly bound up with the cause. And I think the danger here is real. I don't think it's something you can just dismiss. And that's why I say hostility toward intellectuals here isn't entirely irrational. And I think it would be better, to live with the risk than to exclude, silence, or marginalize intellectuals and social movements. And I think any legitimate political ethics has to be rooted in sound values and goals. After all, not all social movements are good, right? Consider fascist and racist movements. These also can be rooted in solidarity. Some might be earnestly but naively participating in a rotten movement. So I think it's imperative to remain self-critical and open to listening to objections from honest and sincere critics. It's essential to avoid a kind of ideological dogmatism and kind of self-satisfied ignorance that Wright warned us about. And intellectuals, at least sometimes, can provide some kind of protection from these pitfalls. There's also a lesson here, I think, about the commitment of solidarity and its role in politics. I don't think there's anything wrong with finding meaning in a political cause, as I've emphasized. I think we should nevertheless be careful not to model political solidarity on religious faith, at least not when such faith is zealous and unshakable. Sometimes it's right and wise to abandon or even oppose a cause that one was previously committed to. Though this certainly, of course, should not be done lightly. It would be a mistake, I think, to construe this change as a kind of apostasy, right? As a defectionist worthy of the equivalent of divine retribution. The idea of apostasy is governed by a kind of ethics of conversion, where abandoning the cause is treated as a kind of unforgivable offense, possibly one that's subject to punishment. Joining a group in political solidarity is not the same thing as joining a sacred community of the faithful. I think it's critical that the political ethics of the oppressed avoid confusing the two. There's a kind of anxiety that intellectuals create in political movements. Political leaders sometimes fear that the masses might be led away from a profound truth, a truth whose embrace might actually be necessary for their liberation. So the worry that intellectuals will produce needless doubt in those who lack the sophistication to evaluate complex evidence and arguments, that's what's motivating this kind of what I'm calling kind of political paternalism. After all, the truth isn't always as obvious, right? It isn't always transparent or easily understood. And so persuasive thinkers in a movement might even inadvertently be a kind of reactionary element within the movement, leading people away from vital causes or fostering a kind of factionalism within the movement. So again, the danger, I think, is a real one. It's not an irrational fear. But an ethical response to this genuine risk can be to root out and purge intellectuals in the movement. Better, I think, to rely on political education and constructive debate, to trust that a better argument will ultimately win out. Now, that said, I think the burden can't rest solely on movements to accommodate the idiosyncrasies of intellectuals. Right? We as intellectuals have to prove ourselves to be trustworthy allies, committed not only to critical thought, but to the practical demands of solidarity. We have to earn the trust of our comrades without compromising our devotion to the life of the mind. And this is going to mean resisting the temptation to be so absorbed in abstract theorizing that we lose sight, say, of the practical exigencies of collective struggle, especially the need at times, amid deep uncertainty, to take action, sometimes without the benefit of a comprehensive analysis or a blueprint. It's also going to mean accepting the outcomes of democratic decision-making within the movements, even when we harbor reservations about those decisions, right? The positions we defend have to be guided not only by a hunger for prestige or for money or for fame, but they have to be rooted in a genuine commitment to truth and justice. We have to remain in honest dialogue with the broader political community, open to its critique of our ideas, and have to be willing to share our work beyond elite platforms. And our political courage has to extend beyond a mere embrace of provocative, unconventional views, has to include a readiness to make some concrete sacrifices for the benefit of the cause. Of course, some political leaders are going to fear intellectuals because these leaders don't want to, say, lose their power to direct the political choices of those who follow them. might engage in what I'm here calling political paternalism, kind of trying to shield ordinary people from what are regarded as dangerous or heretical ideas. And whether they do so for benevolent reasons or out of pure lust for power, I think they obviously act unethically. And here I'm just simply following Martin Luther King Jr. and thinking that our political means have to be as morally defensible as our fundamental political aims. Evil means are not redeemed by the desirable outcomes they might produce. Indeed, where possible, our means should prefigure our ends and thereby be a kind of model for the kind of social relations that we hope to ultimately create. So what I'm here calling the political ethics of the oppressed should be rooted in a kind of democratic ethos. Right? We should approach our fellows in solidarity on a plane of equality, trust, and mutual respect. Now, as I reflect on this a bit, I've come to think that there might be somewhat more space for intellectuals to be committed to a political movement or a political cause than there is for them to be committed to a particular political organization. Political movements are usually somewhat amorphous and open-ended. Different organizations with their own specific platform and institutional structure can participate in the same movement. The ideals of political movement are subject to a range of interpretations by the people who participate in them. There's a sense in which the ideals of the movement are kind of ever evolving, open to refinement through debate and public discussion. So in this sense, Wright, we might say, as a committed intellectual, could certainly be a communist, small c communist, but he couldn't be a member of a communist party. The same problem, as it turns out, plagued another intellectual in the Black radical tradition, W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, Du Bois, as you all probably know, was the co-founder of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. Yet he was twice, had a fierce and bitter feud with the organizational leadership, prompting him to leave the organization, or some might say to be pushed out. Both departures from the NAACP are the result of Du Bois's evolving thinking about racial oppression and economic injustice, and how his change in views had conflicted with the official position of the organization. First departure was because Du Bois came to advocate a kind of pragmatic Black self-segregation economic cooperation in opposition to NAACP's uncompromising stance against all forms of racial separatism. And the second departure was because Du Bois became increasingly radical in his political outlook, and he actually openly defended the Soviet Union during the Red Scare, despite the NAACP's staunch anti-communist position. So although Du Bois's commitment to Black solidarity and to the cause of Black freedom never wavered over his very long and illustrious life, as an intellectual, he was constantly rethinking his political philosophy, reconsidering things he had previously believed, and constantly rethinking the concrete measures that he thought that was necessary to realize whatever vision he happened to be embracing at the time. So in reflecting on the life and thought of Richard Wright and W.E.B. Du Bois, I think we can see a challenging and sometimes painful tension between intellectual life and political solidarity. For those committed to both the pursuit of truth and the fight for justice, the path is often fraught. The intellectual's natural inclination to question, to revise, to dissent can sometimes put us at odds with the norms of loyalty and trust that solidarity demands. Yet I think it'd be a great mistake for political movements, particularly those rooted in the active resistance of the oppressed themselves, to view this tension as a kind of threat that really should be extinguished. It's better seen, I think, as a kind of necessary, maybe even productive friction, one that kind of keeps our ideals honest, if you like, our commitments reflective, our movements open to growth. Wright's own break with the Communist Party, like Du Bois's repeated departures on NAACP, should not be seen as acts of betrayal or apostasy, but as principled refusal to subordinate intellectual integrity to organizational conformity. Their examples remind us that fidelity to a cause does not always mean fidelity to an organization that claims to represent it. Political solidarity has to leave space for intellectual independence, just as the life of the mind must remain attentive to the practical realities of collective struggles for freedom. I like to think, if when held in balance, these commitments can sharpen one another, fostering both clear and careful thought and grounded practical wisdom. The political ethics of the oppressed is to be defensible. I think it has to resist not only overt forms of domination, but also the sometimes more subtle temptations toward dogma, zealotry, and authoritarianism from within. It must be open to questioning and internal debate. And it has to recognize, I think, the crucial role that intellectuals at their best can play, not despite their critical disposition, but because of it. Thank you.
Let's take a few minutes for questions.
Sure, of course.
Thank you, Professor Shelby. This is an incredibly provocative talk, and something that I've talked with my partner, who's a Filipino art historian, a lot about. To what extent can we, as people of color, sort of engage in the sort of life of the mind away from these acts of solidarity? So I actually wanted to ask a question that I think is a clarifying question. It seems on the one hand, you've come sort of in defense of a kind of intellectualism that one might, or an intellectual life of the mind that one might think of as a kind of aloofness or abstraction, that I can just sort of engage in a practice of work that is wholly removed from movement activity or from solidaristic acts. On the other hand, it seems that there's, in the latter half of the talk, a discussion of intellectualism as a kind of querying or holding movement to account or to truth. And so I just wanted to hear you say a few words that perhaps distinguishes exactly what defense you're offering. Is it for me to be able to engage in a kind of aloof abstraction that's totally removed from acts of solidarity, or is it more the latter, which is a defense of intellectual life that betters movements, for lack of a better word?
So it makes me sad that you asked this question, because I thought you of all people will understand what I was trying to say. So let me try. So I think. So yes, on the one hand, I do want to defend the space for people who are just interested in ideas or creating beautiful things, and that needn't be bent to advancing the group's cause. Such people, of course, can still have a commitment to that collective struggle and still have the sense of solidarity, but they might contribute to the struggle in other ways. So I don't want to say that I don't think it'd be consistent with solidarity to not contribute anything to the struggle. What I've come to think is, I was just kind of reading through, I mean, this is like a constant reflection of an African-American political thought about how to think about intellectuals, what's the role of them, and so on. And most of the things that I read about, kind of going back and looking at people writing about it, they usually just start with the assumption that there are such responsibilities and then get about the business of trying to say what they are. But I was interested in, well, why I think there is a distinctive, like, what's the argument for that? And that's how I was led to thinking about this argument of solidarity. And what I came to find was that I think there's as philosophers might call a kind of suppressed premise in the argument that just kind of ended up sitting in the background but doing most of the work. And so I wanted to kind of highlight it. And that's, I think, the premise that there's a kind of division of labor within the group that we all have to heed. It's almost as if it kind of comes down from on high. It's like, you know, here are all the talents and abilities within the community, and you're supposed to figure out, given what you have available to you, how you could best advance the cause. I think that's what's doing a lot of the work in the argument, but I don't think it can really stand up to full scrutiny. So I think it's perfectly compatible with something I do believe, which is that each person who's committed to solidarity with others, whether that's their group or some other political cause, and need not be just made up of members of an oppressed group, that commitment does require sacrifice and contributing in various things. So I'm just denying the division of labor premise, if that makes sense.
So what I heard as I was listening to your description about Richard Wright's life, it just struck a chord with me. He must have been the protagonist in Invisible Man. So that's what first struck me. But then the comment about how the cell he joined, being the communist cell he joined, being all Black, and then the description of how his conflicts were arising, it just made me think that maybe there was something about white supremacy in the Communist Party that he was having to struggle with. I mean, it wasn't really, maybe it wasn't blatantly said, but it was like there were orders coming down from the top of the party that were saying, this is how we're going to take the struggle, right? And then there's not there wasn't any recognition by the higher ups in the party that people were really, I mean, these were equal peoples. They're not as intellectuals, Richard Wright was probably maybe even above what the white communist hierarchy was at. So I was kind of wondering, what is that? Maybe there's a role for intellectuals in the Black liberation movement or any of these liberation movements that we have to that these are really more allies, and they should be treating these liberation movements as intellectually equivalent, or that level thinking. And I was also, a second point that I was thinking of was like, so these suppression of intellectuals is not just, it's not just for biracial groups or anything. I mean, even you have your gay people. They have the powers that be have suppressed them, and they actually, we have to be struggling against the whole idea that intellectuals of whatever persons are not equivalent, or should not have freedom. I'm thinking of, say, like the fact that Turing, we know him as this person who decrypted the Enigma machine, but he was also extremely high intellect in the mathematical sciences, and by the laws of England at that time, he was forced to, physically suppress himself, and that.
Okay. Yeah. I'll tell you a quick response. So yes, I meant the lesson I'm trying to draw to be general. I mean, as a Professor Green suggested, I do the work kind of at the intersection of philosophy and Black studies, and a lot of times what I'm doing is I reflect on Black life, Black letters, Black practice, is drawing out what more general truths. So I meant it in that sense. On the first point, I don't know. I mean, I think that Wright would, I mean, certainly wouldn't deny that there was racism in the Communist Party, but it's interesting that he often would praise he felt like they were much more committed to engaging political on terms of equality than any other white people he'd ever encountered. And as he says in the, in the full volume, Black Boy, when his first was published, it just had the first part just about his life in the South. But the second part is, to imagine the publisher was less interested in, didn't want to publish, was about his time in Chicago and time in the Communist Party. And like the version we have, most of us read now, and partly the work of Arnold Rampersad, who's professor here for a long time, and bring up the Library of America editions of Wright's work. That edition, you can see a broader view. So he'll talk about the Communist Party as the horror and the glory. And he talks about, emphasized the horror in some ways, but the glory he thought was there was a commitment to the idea of peoples of all sorts living together on terms of equality. And he felt like in communist practice, it was more present than in other groups he had found. So I wouldn't want to in highlighting the limitations of their political practice, misrepresent how he thought about his relationship to the party.
Thank you very much for this excellent lecture, highly necessary today to think about these issues. So my question comes from not the history of racial relationships and blackness, but the history of the left. I was particularly, I found particularly important your definition of intellectual as not necessarily being an academic. And I was wondering, how does that relate to Gramsci's idea of organic intellectuals? For example, if we think of mid-20th century intellectuals in the US, we can talk about Duke Ellington as one of the most profound thinkers of the assembly at that time.
I won't give another lecture on Gramsci. I find the view of intellectuals very, really broad and capacious in Gramsci, and I was trying to do something be slightly different. In Max Weber would sometimes talk about there being a kind of ideal type, and I was trying to represent a kind of ideal type of an intellectual. So if you imagine like the vocation of intellectual, what are the kind of demands that would go along with that, right? I mean, if you really are committed to seeking truth and trying to figure out what's true, then these other things are just kind of going to go with it, right? Now, of course, we don't many of us who claim to be intellectuals don't always live up to that, or anything like that. But I certainly didn't want to suggest that only, say, like academics or internationally famous artists could be intellectuals, right? I do share that broader sense that there are many intellectuals who are, poor, disadvantaged, marginalized, in prison, and never get these kind of platforms to kind of say what they think, but they still have those dispositions. They still have that orientation. And I didn't want to kind of downplay that. I think that's really important to appreciate as well. So in that sense, I'm certainly on the same page.
So my question is mostly relevant to what this gentleman asked. Also, I came at the very end. I was listening in the other room, so your talk. So I didn't, show up just at the end. I'm a PhD candidate in anthropology, working on solidarity as well. So in your equation, almost solidarity and intellectualism are kind of a little in relation with each other, but also at the opposite end of the equation. So is it possible to think conceptually an intellectual life without solidarity? Isn't it as very central in the concept that we cannot root out something as a separate? And I'm asking this also when I'm thinking about the Black tradition of the 60s and the 70s, how do you formulate Black Panthers into this then? With their solidarity engagements and their, because their ways of gathering knowledge is very related with solidarity, is the practice of solidarity. It's not something that is an intellectual engagement. They gathered from the life, from the engagement. So and two questions that I'm curious, what do you think?
Thanks. So what I was imagining when I think about the tension is that these are, when I say commitments, these are things that a person could take on as a commitment. Need not, but could, right? So you could take on both. That means one could take on the desire to live a life of the mind and to try to follow that through as best as possible, but you need not, right? And I don't think we would criticize people if they didn't, even if they have the talent, if they didn't do it, right? And then there's the commitment of solidarity for justice causes, let's say. And there, I still think it will be true that we think of it as something that one undertakes rather than has it imposed, even though I think, unlike in the first case, it might be correct to criticize someone for not undertaking a commitment. It's a different criticism than the criticism that they're undertaking the commitment and fail to live up to it, which is mostly what I'm interested in here, than suggesting that here's a commitment they should undertake, but they didn't, right? The Panther, so the other thing I wanted to say is, of course, it can be the case that someone finds meaning and moral purpose in the pursuit of a political cause. And many people have done that. And I think that's probably a better description of certainly someone like Huey Newton, but many others who, while having intellectual disposition and an interest, really was devoting himself to advancing a cause, right? A lot of people do that. And nothing I was saying here is meant to be a criticism of that. It's just that there are people who have intellectual dispositions and talent who choose not to turn those to the advancement of the cause. But nothing wrong with the people who do. Well, often in that case, what's happening is there's a criticism that the person should be bending those talents and dispositions to the cause. And I wanted to suggest some limitations in that line of argument. There were hands, but I don't know where the microphone currently sits.
We could take one more question. Sorry, yeah, and then Roland, were you?
Bring the proceedings to a close.
Thank you very much. My question builds a little bit on what other people have said. Do you think the very nuanced, I think, and excellent conclusions you've drawn read across to people who are outside oppressed groups? In other words, where the situation is a situation of allyship. People outside the groups who feel they have a lot of sympathy and would like to be good allies for people within the oppressed groups. Is your analysis and your conclusions, do you think, do they read across pretty much as they stand, or is modification needed?
Yeah, it's more complicated in that case. So, I mean, I think that the conclusion I'm coming to, I think, feel most compelling in the context of oppressed groups, where the group is making claims on its more advantaged members, or its members who have talents and resources that they think, how could you be using it for that when you could be using it for this, right? It has I think it resonates more in that context, and it resonates all the more depending on how oppressed a group is, right? So I don't think it does. I think it still exists outside, as many of us who have been professors for a long time, you can attest. When you're talking to graduate students who will come to you and say, I'm really struggling, should I keep, doing my PhD, when there are all these injustices, and I'm committed to trying, and it needn't be the ones that like, they're a part of, say, the marginalized group on whose behalf they want to struggle, but they still feel the tension, right? They still feel that, in this case, like, justice demands that they make some sacrifices of their own personal ambitions to contribute to the cause. So I do think it's more general, probably isn't as acute in that case than it is amongst oppressed peoples. And certainly in the history of Black political thought, it's just an ongoing, it's long debate within the group about this issue. So it's something that I've thought about in that context more, but I certainly think it applies to other groups and to people who don't particularly think of themselves as a member of an oppressed or historically oppressed group, but does see themselves as committed to solidarity with others in a joint and reciprocal commitment to realize some political aims. So yes, I do think it extends.